Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Shannon Barrett, Communications Coordinator here at WeedSmart, and today we're going to be talking about handling weeds in a strip and disc system. I'm joined by Southern Extension agronomist Greg Condon and Director of Weeds Research at Sydney University, Dr. Michael Walsh. Thank you for joining us today, Greg and Michael. How are you both going?
Good, thanks, Shannon.
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Shannon.
That's good. All right, before we get into the webinar, I'll just give you a bit of background about WeedSmart. So we're the industry voice delivering science-backed weed control solutions to growers across Australia. And we're industry funded, so everybody that you can see above the line on this slide are our financial partners, and everybody below the line are our in-kind partners. And at the bottom you can see our research partners, and University of Sydney is one of those. So it's good to have you on board today, Michael. And yeah, Greg, I'll hand over to you now. You'll begin the webinar and giving us some background on the strip and disc system, and then we'll hand over to Michael.
Thanks, Shannon. I'll do my presentation first, just an outline of what strip and disc is, and then at the end of that I will swap over to Michael, and he will go into a little bit more detail around some of the research outcomes that his group have achieved in this high residue system. So we'll get into it, if that's okay. So yeah, I'm a representative of WeedSmart, and today this is goes across several platforms. So we've been involved with a number of growers working in high residue farming systems for quite a while. So it's been coined the name strip and disc, which Kirrilly came up with about 6 years ago, and it's sort of run from there. And it really, it's a I guess an evolution of no-till farming. So we're sort of moved to a next level of really high residue, and there's some sort of unique aspects of this system that are good and bad, and we want to just make people aware of how that actually fits. So what is strip and disc? It's been well documented, but I'll go into it a little bit of detail here this afternoon for those who aren't aware. Effectively, you're harvesting very high, so instead of using a standard draper front, we use a specialised front called a shell-borne stripper front, which basically just plucks the grain from the top of the cereal heads and leaves behind very high levels of residue. And then follow up with that, in order to get back through and sow a crop successfully, we're using a disc seeder. So you just can't use a tine seeder in these really high residue systems, particularly very tall standing stubble. So we've sort of looked at disc seeders particularly as being the most appropriate machines or appropriate seeding gear to get back through, and narrow rows are really critical for that. So I'll explain why we've gone narrow rows. It certainly helps with the stripper harvesting, but mainly from an agronomy perspective with weeds and crop yield potential. And the big benefit that's come out of it, I guess a lot of dryland broadacre systems in southern and central parts of the country really focus on timely sowing, calendar sowing. So as we've moved to more residue, we've found we've been able to, with a lot more success so early, maintain sort of marginal surface moisture and also keep deeper stored water. There's not a lot of research on that sort of concept, but certainly from a grower and commercial perspective, we're having great success. I guess the key disclaimer with all this is we really need diverse rotations, because it does put a significant amount of residue into the system, and things like pulses or canola become even more critical to help, for a range of reasons, help control grass weeds such as ryegrass, wild oats and brome. And then to back that up, one of the key non-chemical or cultural weed control tactics we use in this system is harvest weed seed control, which we've got a global expert in Michael Walsh today to help sort of talk in a little bit more detail of how that can fit. So Big Six, the WeedSmart mantra that we sort of use as a platform to base all our integrated weed management messages around. So how does it actually fit in with a strip and disc? So we've got some chaff decks there on a 12-metre CTF system with the ryegrass dropped onto those tram lines. So we've got a cultural harvest weed seed control program there and a pulse crop. So how can we get the high residue systems to sort of maintain I guess a Big Six principle? So the key things of the Big Six, as you might be well aware, are diverse rotations, double knock, mix and rotate of herbicides, crop competition, stopping seed set, and harvest weed seed control. So a key one of strip and disc with these residue systems that we just can't use pre-emergent herbicides, particularly with that level of standing stubble like we would in a standard knife point press wheel system. So the cultural control tactics come to the fore. So the things like diverse rotations, crop competition and harvest weed seed control, believe it or not, have a really strong fit in this strip and disc or high residue farming system. So it's been an evolution. We've learnt this as we've gone as to what works and what doesn't. So we're still learning, and growers have been really sort of challenged in some situations with how they can maintain profitable crop production but not allow the weeds to take over. So a driver for many of us in southern central New South Wales and into northern New South Wales and Queensland, the last 3 years have been effectively very brutal. So you wouldn't think that today, looking out the window, it's actually raining here in Junee in southern New South Wales, but it's really been a tough run. And I guess extreme events are often a catalyst for change. And there's been excessive topsoil loss. It's those sort of 3 really low rainfall seasons and the sort of compounding effect that has on farm profitability. So growers, they're pretty savvy to that. And I guess this is sort of seen as the evolution of how we can improve ground cover and really make the most of limited amounts of rainfall or sort of variable rainfall patterns that we often see. It's the evolution of a niche system. So here's a photograph from someone on the Darling Downs, Peter Bache and his family. So they are making it work in the northern region, which is probably seen the lowest adoption of the strip and disc, but we've been pretty comfortable with things like stubble retention, summer fallow and pre-em herbicide use, pre-crop, early sowing and the use of double break rotations where we might have a pulse followed by canola. So the strip and disc sort of follows back on top of that. So we initially started using disc seeding and CTF, controlled traffic farming. So we were managing the compaction, narrow rows for weed competition and yield gains in cereals, and then crop topping and harvest weed seed control to start to capture late season weeds, either through the chemicals with pulses and canola, or harvest weed seed control, which is a physical destruction of weed seeds late in the season. And then the last part of the system, actually, believe it or not, has been the stripper front. So whilst we talk strip and disc, it's to us, the success comes from getting all those things on that list right first, including even the ones that are well adopted in conventional systems, such as early sowing or double breaks, before the adoption of the bottom end. So it's a stripper front to sort of complement it all. So you've got to get the basics right, all the 1%ers to get the system to work to its most efficient. And most people are aware of that, but you've still just got to keep reminding the industry of what's important and what's not at times. So the first step is disc seeding, and there's an image from a local grower here who they're planting fava beans into a double stubble. So that's a barley stubble from 18, which followed a wheat stubble from 17. So 2 really high residue years, and then going back into the pulse phase with a quite aggressive crop in terms of fava beans with its ability to get through that heavy, thick straw. So the principles are around zero till, retaining stubble, and that ability to keep that soil moisture at sowing. So that's sort of been a catalyst for that move into disc seeding. And we're really keen on calendar sowing, as is a lot of the southern region. So that ability to sow early, sow timely, and with the right phenology, with the right varieties to mitigate the risk from frost and heat. And a lot of this is sort of quite soil type specific, but in our medium to heavy textured clay soils, the ability to do all this dry sowing, early seeding, and not generate a lot of clods, which sort of can compromise pre-emergent herbicide use or even crop establishment in some soils with high levels of sodicity, has been really important, and the zero-till system helped eliminate that. And the big one is, I'll say it a few times in this presentation, is narrow row spacing. So really bringing those row spacings in closer for helping with yield, but crop competition is a big one. So weeds do not compete well with competitive crops. So those crops don't need to be necessarily that thick if you're in lower or medium rainfall zones, but it certainly does help to spatially distribute those crop rows across more area rather than having them allow weeds to sort of take up the space. And then the last one is ground cover. So we're sort of measuring improvements in fallow efficiency where we bring our row spacings in closer. So disc seeding, I focus on the detail is a key aspect. So there's a modern configuration here with a hydraulic downforce. a lot of emphasis put around the closing. So it needs to be a precision seeder to get the best out of this gear. It's not just any old disc seeder that's replacing a tine unit. It needs to be a step up and help improve crop establishment, which is often being conducted in fairly marginal conditions in our autumns. I guess sowing starts at harvest, so a really big emphasis around spreading that residue. If you're still looking at a draper front, for example, you really, often have to take a bit more grain through that, a bit more straw through the header, so that residue needs to be spread evenly. Penetration, so having that hydraulic downforce has been critical. Sharp disc and quite a few aftermarket components such as the seed firming wheels and crumbler wheels that really help maintain that furrow being closed, whether you're in all different sort of soil types. So you can have a variable clay, which might go from a red loam to a grey clay to a vertisol in the one paddock. We want accurate seed placement across all those soil types, no matter what the conditions. And this modern equipment is really allowing us to do that. There's no doubt challenges. You can actually see some pretty severe hairpinning here in a scenario with canola sown early. That's the enemy of disc seeding, and something we work really hard on mitigating. So that chaff can be quite toxic, so it's a poor spreading job from the header. So you really limit that ability to have good seed soil contact. Wet clay is a challenge, wet straw is a challenge. Having that residue spread, as I mentioned before, is important. And one thing we really notice in our southern region with these disc systems, particularly in the early stage of adoption, is that slow winter growth. So we call it the winter blues, and the crops often pull out of it later in the season, but it's something that needs to be managed through things like sowing earlier, having diverse rotation, so putting your canola, which is probably one of the highest risk crops in this system, back onto pulse stubbles rather than back into cereal stubbles. So minor agronomic modifications can sort of need to be taken into account. Certainly discs come at a higher maintenance regime, so there certainly takes more time to maintain the discs with greasing in particular, and at a higher cost to a standard tine. So the precision seeding often comes at a cost. And insect pressure in certain crops, such as canola, is often heightened with that level of residue in the system. So slugs, millipedes, slaters can sort of create a lot of problems around canola, which needs to be managed through either earlier sowing or, as I said, putting it into pulse stubbles where that residue is somewhat broken down. And we've even seen armyworms. We've talked to Melina Miles from QDAF on this. It's a favoured environment. They seem to love the tall stripper stubble through the winter for cereals. So it's just a new observation we've made with armyworms being prevalent much earlier in the season in some of our stripper stubbles. So we're looking at some of the soft insecticide options to help overcome some of the issues that they can cause. And the big one for a lot of people, particularly agronomists, when they're sitting down with their growers, is that there's less pre-emergent herbicide options. So the industry's become really dependent on pre-emergent herbicides as a key weed control tactic. So generally agronomists prefer tines, and for good reason, in terms of registrations and crop safety, but there's a lot of innovation and sort of learning that's ongoing in that space, particularly with some of the chemical companies, as they realise the adoption of these high residue farming systems is sort of improving. So we need to keep working on that space and then try and get more of these products on label and registered. But I guess the bottom line for us is that we need to manage some of these challenges with getting the gear set up right, the diverse rotations, and even the use of phenology. So crop length, so winter wheats, long season wheats, for example, sown earlier in the window to help get through some of the challenges that might occur with that winter blues, as we talked about. So there's ways and means around it, and we keep innovating rather than sort of saying it's just all too hard. So diversity beats ryegrass and more. So Tony Swan and his group from CSIRO and Farmlink did a 3-year study at Temora. So if you look at this graph, they had a ryegrass population of 1,864 plants when they started the trial. So really high pressure ryegrass, resistant to several groups. So when they started out, they had 3 programs. Diverse was largely a double break, 4-year rotation of double break with pulse canola, wheat barley, and then the second one, aggressive, was Roundup Ready canola and high cost wheat herbicides like Secura, Avidex, and the conservative was basically a canola wheat rotation, so very low cost OP, TT canola, trifluralin based systems. So if you look over the 3 years of the project, the numbers really sort of blew out by 2017 with the conservative getting well up over 4,000 ryegrass plants a square metre, whereas I guess the diverse rotation where they've had the double break and final crop with competitive barley, they were able to maintain. That was vetch hay followed by canola, so that was able to get that rotation, and largely with no harvest weed seed control and not the ability to do narrow rows. They were just through crop diversity and largely herbicides, they were able to really get that ryegrass population down. So that's some good systems worked from our part of the world. So in terms of narrow rows for yield and weeds, the rule of thumb has been for every 1%, there's a gain. For every inch you go narrow, there's a 1% gain in yield. So that sort of varies between 0.8 to 1.2%, but it's a good rule of thumb. It's well quoted and has a lot of rigour, so it gets questioned a lot, particularly on social media, but there's basically 29 years of data from Glenn Rothmuller in WA, who's had a really long-term trial going at Merredin, which is largely a relatively low rainfall zone. And that was backed up by the E.H. Graham monograph from CSU that Brendan Scott put together, so over 160 trials. They also measured significant differences in yield with narrow row spacings. And even Guy McMullen from New South Wales DPI in the north found between $6 and $16 a hectare loss per centimetre increase in row spacing. So there's lots of data around. And Michael Walsh and John Broster, who we'll hear from later today, they've sort of also found with weed competition, it can assist with harvest weed seed control. So ryegrass in particular and brome will seek light, and that really helps with weed seed capture. And then there's a plethora of other weed competition data from Chris Preston with 50% seed reductions with ryegrass in hybrid canola with early sown and pre-em combinations. So Michael Widerick's also found that in the northern zone in chickpeas and mung beans with less south thistle and less almost barnyard grass, where those generally non-competitive pulses are grown on narrow rows. So it's an awkward conversation with the industry, but we keep bringing it up as people passionate about cultural weed control tactics. So from my perspective, I guess there's so much data and there's so many resistant weeds. So that's why we think it's time for a shift in thinking around crop competition and row spacing. So the final step, I guess, in terms of looking at this strip and dish system is the stripper front. As I said before, it's a Shelbourne Reynolds header front made in the UK. So effectively the rotating fingers will just effectively strip the grain from the cereal head, the wheat and barley head, and 85% of that grain is threshed in the front, and then there's limited chaff going through the header. So it's an old concept, the stripper front, but yeah, the Shelbourne Reynolds company have refined it and modernised it into a pretty sleek unit. So it allows some pretty high capacity to be generated from harvesting. So up to 50 to 70 tonne an hour has been pretty handy for timeliness and quality downgrades. The big one is the reduction in fuel. So you're using 50% less per hectare or per tonne. So it's really a big gain in capacity. Can sort of turn an operation that might need sort of 2 headers or 1.5 headers back to 1 header for the area that's been covered. So it's really important, that productivity gain. So there's a high harvest, so less cost, less header wear, and even less R&M. And one observation we've made, there's sort of no need for some of the high cost, high horsepower, I guess, straw or residue handling kits that go on the back of headers, as in the MAV or a power car. So that's been a big saving to offset the cost of the stripper front. So we're left with tall stubble, which has helped with shading and moisture. And we're seeing, again, from anecdotal paddock measurements, was a lift in fallow efficiency by 25 to 30% just through that retention of more water even at the surface, not always at depth. So that's some pretty significant numbers after the last three dry years in our region. And again, work done by Michael Walsh and John Broster. So it's shown that it can strip weed seeds, which is a question that often comes up, particularly brome and ryegrass, just as effectively as the draper front. So yeah, that's been reassuring to see some of that work give confidence around harvest weed seed control. So there's a few growers that are in the space. So Matt and Belinda McKinley from Coolman, really innovative in the way they sort of run their systems. So they've had a Boss bar with XL disc units on 8-inch, had a Shelbourne stripper front for about 4 seasons, and recently went to a mill, which has really helped their weed control program with grasses. So they have diverse rotations, pretty big soils focus, but great ones for sharing information. And you can see a photograph on the right there of a chickpea linseed crop that they have been sort of doing with their integrated system. Matt standing in a paddock there of silage that was cut. So they sort of do all sorts of things to manage their weeds, but the stripper front and the narrow rows with the mill on the back has just been a huge step forward to sort of really help battle the numbers around things like ryegrass and brome, which can start to push through in some of these systems. Mark and Mandy Bowyer from Lockhart, they've been using sort of one of the instigators of getting hydraulic disc units on Excel bars. So he runs another system on 8-inch row spacings or 200 mils, running a shell-borne stripper front. Has also put a mill on the back of the header. But yeah, the crop competition, lots of pulses on their heavy clay soils has really been a big driver of helping keep weed control costs in their cereals and canola quite low. So the rotation side of it, combined with the physical aspects of the cultural tools, have been critical to their success. So the growers, yeah, depending on their soil types, are sort of looking at the different ways they can manage the climatic risk with crop profit. So I guess with all this stuff, it's the combination of in any system, the different components rather than the individual aspects. So as Aristotle said, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that's really the message out of all of this. It's a system, and if one part of the system isn't sort of adopted, often it can sort of see a shortfall in achieving the greater outcome. So that's why we sort of focus on that systems thinking. So in terms of a take-home message, the strip and disc, so you can see Michael Walsh there with the work they were doing at Mara in recent years collecting weed seeds. There's more research that needs to be done, and I applaud Michael and their group from Sydney University and John Brosser from Charles Sturt, because no one else has really sort of got in the paddock and done a lot of applied work in this space. But yeah, we're hopefully going to see more actual agronomy and soils work come into play as well. I guess, as I said, look at the whole system to gain the greatest benefits. So there's lots of minor details around this, which we could talk about all day, but it's just probably being a bit holistic about it. And the cultural big six strategies, they're really essential to make this work. The emphasis probably goes off some of those sort of standard systems like pre-em herbicides and knife point press wheels. It comes back to crop competition, rotation and harvest weed seed control, which we're gaining more and more confidence around their value in these systems. Innovation is not without its challenges, and growers, to their credit, continue to innovate to make these systems more robust, and sharing of information has become critical for that. So there's more battles that will come, but yeah, we certainly need to stay on the front foot to gain the best upside. And I just think that the growers have been the leaders in this space, and there's more data to come, as you see with that photograph there with Michael and his team doing work on farm with foxes at Mara. So they're really open to sort of seeing this work being researched, and we'll see more and more of it come to light in time. So I too like to thank all our industry partners in WeedSmart. I'm passionate about WeedSmart as a global stewardship program. No one else really does it with it's a national stewardship program, but no one else globally does it to the same degree that we do. So we've got GDC as a major partner, and a lot of herbicide companies as well, along with the in-kind partners who are largely research groups. But the big difference is we have cultural weed control partners who are now investing in stewardship in the WeedSmart program. So that's a big step forward as part of the next phase of WeedSmart. And we thank all our sponsors, and especially those new ones that have come on this year to help promote the mill technology. So thank you. I'll finish it up there, stop sharing. So
All right, okay, well, thank you. Thanks, Greg. You've pretty much covered it all. That was really good. So, yeah, well, I guess I'll maybe fill in a few little gaps. Not that there are too many from Greg's presentation. Probably going to look at it at a little bit of a bigger picture level on why we need the residues, and then therefore why the strip and disc system is so important. All right, so yeah, at a bigger picture, we have got changing rainfall patterns. This is a map where the arrows are indicating the shift in the summer dominant rainfall pattern over Australia nationally. and the bigger the arrows indicate the bigger the change in seasonality. So the trend's pretty clear that we're going more towards summer rainfall dominance and where we get our moisture. So our cropping systems need to be prepared for that eventuality or for that occurrence. So there has been an emphasis on residue retention and summer fallows, particularly in the northern areas, but that's now shifting south as the rainfall patterns change. And the reason why we focus on soil residues is that we need to keep the rain where it falls. So we need to restrict runoff and we need to reduce evaporation. We need to get that rain into the soil so we can store it for subsequent cropping operations. And that's becoming more important than ever. The big but, or the big rider in all this is that we still have increasing herbicide reliance. So if we're going to retain residues, then we have to have less and less disturbance, and that means more and more herbicide reliance. And as we've sort of evolved or continue to evolve herbicide resistance to the in-crop selectives, to the post-emergence application herbicides, we've had to rely more and more on residual herbicides. And as we all know, that's fraught with danger when you've got increasing amounts of residue on your soil surface. So there's some real challenges there. So yeah, just briefly on the extent of herbicide resistance, this is not new to anybody. It's quite severe in WA, but it's also troublesome throughout the entire wheat production region or crop production region of Australia. In the areas where we have been relying on stored soil moisture for crop production for a long period of time now, the resistance is to glyphosate. So we've relied on glyphosate for our fallow weed control. Now we've got high frequencies of resistance in a lot of the really problematic summer weed species. And that means that in these systems now we are trying to rely on residual herbicides for our summer weed control, and that's causing no end of problems. Okay, so we need to change our approach. Loss of herbicide resources for a number of reasons, as well as herbicide resistance. And just to add a little bit more detail around the stripper fronts and harvest weed seed control. So the work that we have done, as Greg indicated, over a couple of harvests, is just to look at the differences in efficacy of harvest weed seed control systems when you've got a stripper or a draper front. And somewhat surprisingly, we found that stripper fronts do collect the same amount of weed seeds as the draper fronts do. Now, even though you've got high stubbles left there remaining after harvest, the action of the stripper front is to sort of push that straw over as it's harvesting. So the stripper front's actually operating quite low, and then it does actually pluck the weed seeds off the seed heads as it's moving through. So essentially we found no difference in the collection of ryegrass, wild oats, or I should say brown grass seed there. But there is a but. And this was some work that we found when we looked a bit more closely at annual ryegrass seed collection. So on the y-axis, we've got the proportion of ryegrass seed collected that was present at harvest above I guess a draper front cutting height. And on the x-axis, we've got row spacing. So we had a narrow, around about 6-inch row spacing compared to a 12-inch row spacing. The dark green bar is the seed collection for the draper front, and the light green bar is the seed collection for the stripper front. So when there was narrow row spacing, there was no difference in the annual ryegrass seed collection. But when we had the wider row spacing, we did have a difference. And we believe that difference is really because there's room for the ryegrass seed heads to escape the stripper front. So without the crop stubble propping up those ryegrass tillers or holding them up, there is the opportunity for those tillers to lay down between the rows and avoid being collected. So I guess that's one of the sort of key messages to come out of the work that we've done so far in this space. And I think that's probably about where I'll leave it. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. We haven't had any questions come through so far. Have you got anything else to add, Greg?
Yeah, just Michael, in terms of things like precision weed or site-specific weed control, has there been any work around like the cameras in using in these high residue systems, how well a weeded or a weed seeker can perform when you've got a high level of residue there in a summer fallow?
There hasn't been, well, not as far as I know, there hasn't been any work looking at the issues, but I guess there's anecdotal evidence about reflection from the stubble on the soil surface causing some false positives. That's the only sort of information that I have in that area. Greg, you probably know just as much about that as I do.
Yeah, well, I guess it has been observed, but we actually see some low stubble levels the last 3 or 4 years as we've had more camera sprays come into the region. We actually haven't been able to use them in some really big stubbles yet, so we'll probably know a little bit more after this summer.
Actually, there was one point that I did neglect to mention. That was about the amount of chaff that comes through these systems. We learnt that with the stripper front, there's about 50% less chaff material produced during the harvest operation. So that sort of supports the Greg's comment about not needing the MAV choppers or the high power distribution systems. And it also probably helps the impact mills work more efficiently too. They should do much better with a lot less chaff material going through the system.
Would that affect the cost of maintenance costs, R&M associated with the mills? There's be something to hopefully follow up this year. If a lot more mills out there this year, particularly with stripper fronts, do you think logically that'd help?
Yeah, absolutely. So because the stripper fronts are generally operating a little bit higher, they shouldn't pick up as much sand and grit material.
Okay.
And also, again, with a lot less material going through, yes, there will be, in theory, a lot less wear on those mills. Until we actually measure it, we have to say that with a bit of caution, I guess. Yeah,
well, the adoption of mills has been, I guess, above expectations for this coming harvest. So it'll be really, really good to see them on a whole range of different headers and have stripper fronts on as well. So we'll have some good feedback in that regard.
All right, great. We'll leave it there, I guess. Thank you so much for joining us, Greg and Michael. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Michael, for your time.
Thanks, Greg.
Okay, thanks.